Religious belief is seen as fundamental to a person's identity. Yet throughout the world, there are constant cases where it's being abused. What are the problems and what are the solutions? Join me for real stories, real issues and real views. This is Real Talk. You've talked about schools, but even if you just walk
Very
out...
complicated agenda.
Does it actually mean anything at all?
Okay, this is right and wrong, but he doesn't actually follow it.
We've been in recession for a few years now.
Real stories,
We learn from one another.
real issues. Is Islam a threat? And real views. This is Real Talk. Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another edition of Real Talk. This is the program that looks at some of the social aspects and social issues that affect the youth of today. And in our previous program, we had a look at human rights, and to a certain extent, we're carrying forward that topic. In today's program, we're going to be having a look specifically at religious freedoms. Are religious freedoms under attack, maybe in the West? Is the West actually attacking the religious freedoms of Muslims? And are Muslims even safe to be Muslims in Muslim countries? Those are the issues that we're going to be having a look at on today's program. So first of all, let me start by introducing the panel that I'm joined with today. First of all, I have Amjad Mahmood Khan Sahab. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Real Talk. Amjad is the National Director of Public Affairs for the Ahmadiyya Jamaat in the US, and I'm also joined by Dr. Iftikhar Ahmad Iyas. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Real Talk. Iyas is a well-known face to many people in the community. He was the former national president of the Jamaat here in the UK. So that's my panel that we have, and obviously for our programs we also have our studio audience, which will be putting in their points of view throughout the program. Now, first of all, we're going to be taking a listen to the word on the street, and it's a special video report that we compiled. Our law expert, Qudsi Rashid, went over to Geneva to speak to a member of the OHRC about human rights, and particularly about religious freedoms when it comes to human rights as well. We also have an interview with Shabana Taseed, the daughter of the late Salman Taseed, former governor of Punjab, regarding religious freedom in Pakistan. So let's hand over to Qudsi in Geneva.
The right to religious freedom is what today's programme is all about. And religious freedom is enshrined in all the international human rights documents. It's there in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. It's there in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Religious freedom is important to many people in the world. Their religion and their ability to practice their religion is central to how they choose to live their lives. Yet, in so many parts of the world, religious freedom is being infringed and massive violations of human rights are taking place. I'm here at the United Nations headquarters in Geneva to see what the UN is doing about it. I'm joined by Rory Mungovan, who is the Chief of the Asia Pacific region at the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner. Good afternoon, Rory. If I could turn some questions about religious freedom, and particularly in your area of expertise, the Asia-Pacific region. I mean, do you find that religious intolerance, religious persecution, and essentially violation of rights to have a religion and practice that religion are experienced in the countries in the Asia-Pacific?
Yeah, we see this phenomena as widespread, and of course we see it in the Islamic world, and I think the Ahmadiyya issue is very much a symptom of this, where a kind of theological or conceptual sort of clash of traditions within a religious setting unfortunately become manifest in government policy or legal frameworks in different ways, and of course also become a cause or a reason for actual violence against the communities concerned.
I mean, let's take the example of, for example, as you mentioned, the Ahmadis in Pakistan. I mean, how much do you think it is theological? How much do you think it is people-driven? How much do you think it is state-driven? Or do you think it is a combination of all of those?
I think the problem is when we try to resolve differences of this kind through the application of law, or the suppression of particular voice or identity, rather than through dialogue and a genuine attempt at sort of building and fostering an intra-religious dialogue and an inter-religious dialogue that can really sort of create the space for people to obviously enjoy that freedom of conscience.
I mean, I suppose from the Ahmadi perspective, I mean, these laws, particularly the Ahmadi targeted ones, are the ones that say that if an Ahmadi calls themselves a Muslim, they're imprisoned and so on and so forth, have been in existence since the 70s, the 80s. And any time anyone raises it as an issue, the response that comes back from the government is that they're entitled to have these laws because of the offence that it causes to other Muslims, because Ahmadis are proclaiming themselves as Muslims. I mean, what would your view be on that, and what would you say to the Pakistan government?
I think this becomes a double bind, doesn't it? When it's one thing to talk about blasphemy in an external sense, but when the blasphemy is internal to your own identity and to the religious tradition that you belong, it becomes doubly hard somehow to break through that barrier. And that's not unique in the Islamic world. I mean, we've seen this in relation to other religious or spiritual traditions. But I think in terms of a real solution, ultimately it must lie with the state. And I think the two really significant things that the state needs to put in place, and I don't just mean Pakistan, but many other countries where Ahmadi communities are subject to different kinds of fatwas and legal restrictions. One is to try and facilitate this intra-religious dialogue that's required to build understanding, to reduce intolerance, to bring recognition person to person about different identity traditions. And the second, I think, is to protect people. At the end of the day, these mosques, these enclaves, these communities, these villages will exist, and the state, like it or not, recognition or not, of the religious community concern, does have a fundamental obligation to protect the individuals in terms of their right to life, their physical security, their well-being. And so making sure that the right arrangements are put in place to prevent this kind of intercommunal violence.
Assalamu alaikum. I'm joined today by Sherbano Taseer. She is the daughter of the late governor of the Punjab province, Salman Taseer. Salman Taseer was assassinated in January 2011 following his overt criticism of the misuse of the blasphemy laws. Sherbano herself is a journalist at Newsweek in Pakistan and is an active campaigner for a more progressive Pakistan. Sherbano, welcome to MTA International, and thank you so much for coming all the way from Pakistan to join us.
Thank you.
If I could firstly begin by discussing your father, him being the governor of the largest populace in Pakistan, what do you felt that he particularly stood for?
Well, on my father's grave is written Salman Taseer, Shaheed-e-Insaniyat, which means Salman Taseer, martyr for humanity. And I think that's what he stood for, and that's what he'll be remembered as, a courageous man who went against the tide, and he stood up for something that he believed in, and he was willing to die for it.
If I could now go back to Muhammad Ali Jinnah's original vision for Pakistan, and I would like to state something that he said from the very inception of his presidency, where he said, you are free to go to your temples, you are free to go to your mosques or any other places of worship in the state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion, caste or creed. So since then, how far do you think Pakistan has either digressed from this path, or have there actually been progressive steps?
Well, I think that Pakistan was certainly going down that path, but certain governments in our history, they've made the mistake of appeasing terrorists, and they've allowed a couple of loud clerics to dictate to them. And so as a result, you see these extremely you see that the Pakistani constitution is rife with discriminatory laws, like this blasphemy law, like the Ahmadi law. And these things encourage this very narrow worldview that these radical Islamists have, and they want everyone to be homogenous, and they can't take any other religion or any other belief. And so it's really suffocating to grow up in a society like that, and there's no other word. It's just wrong, because we have Hindus, we have Christians, we have Ahmadis, we have so many different castes and creed, and they're persecuted every single day in Pakistan.
Okay, well, you've alluded to the blasphemy laws. Do you think it's just a constitutional problem of the adoption of laws that repress minorities, or is it also a problem within society as well?
It's definitely a problem within society. I mean, if somebody thinks that they can kill someone just because they've criticized a man-made law, then that's a huge problem.
Well, if I could turn your attention to the atrocities that took place in Lahore in May 2010, where almost 100 Ahmadis were massacred in 2 separate mosques. Now, at the time, and you've alluded to this, that your father, he took a very bold stance and gave a press conference, in fact, where he said that this has placed a very negative impact and negative, I suppose, image on Pakistan itself. Do you think that other politicians have actually since then realized the importance of coming out and speaking about these issues, or is it just a silent acquiesce to terrorism and extremism?
Well, I feel that his death and Shahbaz Bhatti's death brought about a lot of introspection, but still people are too scared. And the problem is that there are many of our leaders will believe something and they will say something else behind closed doors, but when they're in public and there's a mic in their face and a camera, you know, they'll say something else because everybody is scared. It's a very palpable threat, and there's this atmosphere of fear in Pakistan right now. Nobody wants to be the boulder in the path of the extremists that my father was. Nobody wants to take these stands because they've seen what the outcome can be.
Well, in relation to that outcome, do you think that there will come a time for communities such as the Ahmadis that they will also be treated as equal citizens within Pakistan?
I hope so. I mean, right now the thing is that it's in our constitution, and you know, that's the most depressing part, that our constitution has labeled them heretics, and they've, you know, disallowed them from calling themselves Muslims or calling their places of worship mosques, and they're disenfranchised. They can't vote because you know, if they vote, they have to denounce their religion, and you know, either they have to say they're Muslims and not Ahmadis, or they have to say they're another religion. So it's, I mean, I hope that somewhere along the line this can change, that we'll have progressive leaders and parliamentarians who will amend these laws, because it'll have that important trickle-down effect into our society.
Okay, and with regards to the Ahmadiyya community, would you possibly have a message for Ahmadis in Pakistan who continually are suppressed of their rights and their freedoms and are unable to speak out and be able to actually have a voice? Would you have a message for them?
Yeah, I mean, it hurts me that this happens in my country, and I wish that there was something that I could physically do to change this. I don't think that anybody deserves to live that way. But I mean, I think that somewhere along the line there will be a change.
Well, we're grateful for that, and inshallah, hopefully, perhaps when we next interview you, there'll be a lot more good issues to discuss about Pakistan taking better news, I should say. But on behalf of MTA International, I would like to thank you for taking the time to speak to us today.
Thanks. Thank you.
Jazakallah Qudsi for that report. Iftikhar Yasab, I'd like to turn to you first. It seems that in today's world, the West has always been the pioneer of human rights and religious freedoms, but at the same time, in today's world, they're actually, to a certain extent, oppressing and suppressing religious freedoms. What are your views on that?
Well, obviously, as we know, freedom of faith and expression and belief is part of the Human Rights Charter. It is there. But then, after several years of experience, it was found that this particular article of the Charter was not being taken seriously, and it was being abused, actually, because of religious intolerance. So, as a result of that, the Human Rights, which used to be Commission and is now Council, it set up a special committee for religious intolerance, and they appointed a special rapporteur, a secretary, who was to take care of the complaints related to religious intolerance. And because of that religious intolerance, you find that the freedom of faith and belief and practice was particularly affected and is still affected.
So, Amjad, just turning to you, it seems to be that, you know, sometimes Muslims are very dependent of their rights. You know, they always bring up the Palestine issue, whether it's Iraq as well. Do you think it's right that they focus primarily on these areas where Muslims are being subjected to these human rights abuses?
I think to some extent it's absolutely important to focus on the denial or deprivation of the rights of Muslims in these countries, but Islam is consistent with the rights for all people, all persuasions, all religions. That is why there are churches in Islamic countries. That is why there are synagogues in Islamic countries. So it's very important that Muslims should focus on universal human rights. So when they defend their own rights, they should not do so at the expense of other communities. They should also uphold the rights of others.
Okay. Yes, I would like to pose the same question to you as well. Do you think it's right that Muslims actually prioritize, in terms of human rights abuses and fighting for just causes, that they always go to Muslim countries first to actually uphold their rights first and put them as the main priority?
Well, actually, you see, the fundamental guidance that we have, the teaching that we have, is La ikraha fi din. There is absolutely no compulsion in religion. And that is what Muslims have always observed. Even during the time of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we know that when he migrated to Medina, right at the beginning, he was very particular that the rights, the religious rights of all the other communities and their civic rights should not only be upheld, but respected. And that example has to be followed by all the Muslim states in the world of today.
I mean, in the first half of the program, I want to focus mainly on the West as well. Recently, we've seen, you know, bans put on the headscarf, the veil, and also the minaret bans as well. Where is this sort of legislation coming from?
So it's important to first not treat the West as a monolith.
Okay.
The West itself consists of many different countries, and particularly, let's take Europe and the United States, since the panel here is well suited to talk about those issues.
Yeah.
With respect to the specific pieces of legislation that discriminate, you provide two examples. One is legislation, and indeed it is the law now, after a long ordeal, in France to ban the burqa. And the second is the Swiss ban of the minarets. Both of those two pieces of legislation were a product of both Switzerland and France being very much preoccupied with the notion of separation of church and state, to such an extent that they would restrict religious freedoms of Muslims in order to make that interest paramount. But the United States is much different. In the United States, there is no current legal provision that would restrict the burqa, any form of the headscarf, or that would ban any religious symbols, period.
So you're saying from a legal perspective, it wouldn't be possible to pass forward this type of legislation?
That's exactly right. There is Islamophobia growing in the United States. There is real concern. There are states that have attempted to ban the headscarf in public schools, for example, Oklahoma and Oregon. But the United States, on behalf of Muslims, has litigated this issue in US courts and have fought against those bans. The president of the country, Barack Obama, addressing the Muslim world, very emphatically declared that there are well over 1,000 mosques in the US, and the US will go to court to defend the rights of Muslims.
But at the same time, in the United States, we saw the burning of the Quran as well. So how is that possible for these two things to happen at the same time?
So the idea, so there's two very important differences. First and foremost, the Quran burning controversy involved freedom of expression. In the United States, perhaps unlike Europe, that particular activity is not illegal, because the United States courts, through the jurisprudence that has developed, has made it a point to protect free speech to such an extent that you can burn a religious holy book. They have not made the similar stance with respect to freedom of religion, because the freedom of religion has two aspects, the free exercise clause and the establishment clause. So that particular religious restriction would not survive constitutional scrutiny, unlike the Quran burning. So it's a very complex dynamic.
Right, okay. I mean, yes, one thing we touched on there is this sort of fear of Islam that's growing amongst Western countries and in Europe as well. What's your view on that? How can we tackle that? And is it being overexposed by the media? Is it being blown out of proportion?
Well, you see, a dangerous development that has taken on after the charter is that there are countries which are specifically legislating to curb the freedom of faith and religion. We ourselves are victims of it in Pakistan and in some other countries. We have another force which is working against the interests of Islam,
Right.
and that is the edicts, the fatwas of mullahs. And there is no country, I mean, the West has made no effort, America has made no effort, or any country has made no effort to restrain these mullahs
Right.
from issuing these edicts against one sect or one congregation or another denomination. This continues to go on. And this is a serious threat to the freedoms of faith and practice and religion.
I mean, we talked about the minaret ban in Switzerland, and we actually have a special video report about that. Our team went out to Switzerland and managed to speak to the MP who actually pushed for this ban, and we also spoke to some of the general public there about their views as well. So let's take a listen to that special video report.
Grüezi, Herr Wobmann. Sie sind Nationalrat im Schweizer Parlament, im Nationalrat da. Vielen Dank, dass Sie sich die Zeit genommen haben, mit uns das Interview zu machen. Es geht um religiöse Freiheit und Toleranz auch gegenüber Religionen in Europa und im Westen allgemein. Sagen Sie doch kurz etwas zu Ihrer Person.
Ich bin seit 8 Jahren im Nationalrat in der Schweiz, bei der Schweizerischen Volkspartei und habe unter anderem eben die Initiative Verbot von Minarett durchgeführt.
Ja, die Frage ist in dem Sinn, die Initiative zu dem Minarettverbot hat ja ganz gezielt auf eine Gruppe gezielt. Das heißt, dass wirklich eine Gruppe gezielt dann ausgeschlossen worden ist von der Ausübung von ihren religiösen Tätigkeiten. Im Westen hat man ja bis jetzt immer als eine sehr offene kulturelle Entwicklung gehabt. Man hat gesehen, dass auch der Westen geschafft hat, in anderen Ländern religiöse Freiheiten einzuführen, die das vorher nicht hatten. Wieso ist denn ausgerechnet in der Schweiz dann so eine Initiative zustande gekommen und auch so offensichtlich angenommen wurde?
Gut, also religiöse Freiheiten, die haben wir natürlich nach wie vor in der Schweiz. Die sind nie eingeschränkt worden, auch nicht mit dem Minarettverbot. Es geht nur um das Machtsymbol, um das Minarett, die Machtsymbol vom politischen Islam. Das geht nicht gegen die Religion Islam an solches, sondern gegen die zunehmende Islamisierung durch den politischen Islam. Und das ist natürlich schon ein riesen Unterschied. Es steht auch eigentlich unserem freiheitlich-demokratischen Gesellschaftssystem eigentlich konträr gegenüber, wo sich in diesem Sinn nicht verträgt. Und so gesehen ist natürlich der Widerstand aus der Bevölkerung und wie man sieht, jetzt auch europaweit.
Vorher ist die Minarettfrage eigentlich nicht so gross thematisiert gewesen, obwohl in Zürich steht das Minarett schon seit fast 50 Jahren und es sind nie politische Bestrebungen irgendwie gekommen von dort. Was sagen Sie dazu?
Hat aber nichts zu tun mit dem Ausüben von der Religion, das kann jeder in der Schweiz. Das ist ja nur das Symbol. Inzwischen gibt es natürlich Länder, die sogar Burkas verbieten, das ist Kleidung. Das geht tiefer, wenn man vorschreibt, was man am Morgen anzulegen hat, als ob jetzt der Gebetsraum noch ein Machtsymbol, also ein Türmchen oder einen Turm hat, je nachdem wie gross er ist. Geht natürlich ein Burka-Verbot bedeutend tiefer. Also jetzt Frankreich hat das eingeführt, Belgien hat es beschlossen. Ich glaube, in Spanien ist auch eine Diskussion. Es ist schon etwas im Gang gegen die zunehmende Islamisierung auch vom radikalen Islam, geprägt natürlich. Nicht die Muslime, die hier in der Schweiz leben, die seit langem hier leben und normal in der Ordnung leben, hat kein Mensch etwas, also die haben auch nicht Probleme. Also ich habe ja selber in meinem persönlichen Umfeld Leute, die ich sehr gut mag und man befreundet ist, das ist absolut kein Problem.
Ich habe vorher schon erwähnt, dass die Moschee in Zürich noch nie so Anstrebungen gemacht hat. Es wird immer vom Islam im Allgemeinen als etwas Böses oder etwas Herrschaftssüchtiges geredet. Wieso wird denn nicht zwischen den verschiedenen Gruppierungen vom Islam unterteilt? Also im Christentum wird ja immer unterteilt. Katholiken, Reformierte, Protestanten und so weiter. Wieso wird das nicht im Islam gemacht? Weil wir wären ja heutzutage schon so weit, das können zu machen.
Gut, dort ist natürlich die Unterscheidung schwierig zu machen beim Islam. Es gibt verschiedene Gruppierungen, verschiedene Richtungen, das stimmt und das ist auch völlig anerkannt. Zürich, die Moschee dort in Zürich, das ist eine einzige, das ist wieder die Frage der Menge. Und die Gruppierung, die dort ist, hat wahrscheinlich nicht die Ziele, die vielleicht andere haben. Und meines Wissens haben auch die nichts gegen unsere Verfassung und unsere Gesetzgebung. Ich komme nicht mehr auf das Gleiche zurück. Und unsere Verfassung beruht auf Freiheit, Demokratie.
Sind die Probleme denn bis jetzt gelöst worden? Es sind ja mittlerweile schon 1,5 Jahre vergangen, seit die Minarett-Initiative angenommen worden ist.
Also was jetzt in Gang gekommen ist, einerseits ist natürlich jetzt ein Verbot da, das ist klar. Das ist jetzt klar in der Verfassung bei uns. Andererseits ist durch die Minarett-Initiative eigentlich eine offene Diskussion entstanden. Die Diskussion ist eigentlich entspannter, als sie früher war. Früher ist es eigentlich unter dem Deckel gehalten worden, möglichst nicht diskutieren. Und das ist immer gefährlich.
Vielleicht ein Schlusswort. Man hat mit verschiedenen Initiativen gesehen, dass sie nach einer Zeit dann wieder umgekippt worden sind. Gäbe es eine Möglichkeit, wenn man den Dialog mit den Islamvertretern würde finden, einen friedlichen Dialog, wenn man Regeln würde einführen würde, die alle würden, einige schon befolgen, andere dann auch würden befolgen. Gäbe es denn eine Möglichkeit, dass man die Minarett-Initiative, das Verbot von diesen Türmchen, wieder, eigentlich sozusagen, wieder entfernen, mit einer Volksabstimmung natürlich. Könnte das möglich sein in einer zukünftigen Zeit?
Also die Möglichkeit eben mit unserem System, mit unserem direktdemokratischen System, ist sicher gegeben. Und wenn das eine Mehrheit findet im Volk, ja, dann ist es auch ein Volksentscheid, der zu akzeptieren gibt. Und ja, die Möglichkeit ist sicher da. Aber ich denke, da müsste einiges passieren.
Ja, aber das wäre natürlich unser Ziel, dass man dann den Dialog fördert und immer das Gespräch sucht. Gut. Ich danke Ihnen, Herr Wobmann.
Bitte schön.
Danke, dass Sie sich so viel Zeit genommen haben. Ich hoffe, Sie haben es interessant gefunden, das Interview zu machen. Und ja, vielen Dank.
Merci auch vielmals.
Also das Verbieten von Minarett in der heutigen Welt braucht.
Ich finde irgendwie eigentlich, es hat gar keinen Sinn, weil jeder hat das Recht dazu, in die Kirche zu gehen. Also Kirche, ja, also das Glauben, sich zu äußern. Ja.
Ich finde es ein völliger Quatsch. Nein, auf jeden Fall nicht.
Ich denke nicht, nein. Die Leute praktizieren ihren Glauben und ihre Religion genau weiter.
Nein, darf ich sagen? Nein, überhaupt nicht, weil ich finde, erstens, dass es überhaupt nicht bringt, weil ich finde, man sollte überall eine Religionsfreiheit haben. Und ich meine, wegen einem Kirchenturm so ein Drama machen, das finde ich überhaupt nicht gut.
Nichts. Also, was es gebracht hat, ja, es ist nicht gut.
Denken Sie, hat es einen Einfluss gehabt auf religiöse Freiheiten, das Minarettverbot hier in der Schweiz im Allgemeinen? Was denken Sie dazu?
Dazu kann ich eben nur sagen, wie das Gleiche. Ich meine, jeder sollte Freiheit haben, in die Kirche zu gehen. Aber ich verstehe auch die Schweiz wiederum, weil halt ja.
Also ich finde es schlecht für die Schweiz, weil wir ja eigentlich reden von Religionsfreiheit und ich finde es kontraproduktiv.
Okay. Ja. Hat es sonst noch irgendwelche Anmerkungen dazu? Oder?
Also ich fände es gut, wenn man es weiterhin bauen dürfte.
Ja, ich denke, Religionsfreiheit ist in der Schweiz sehr wichtig. Es ist natürlich schon so bei allen Religionen, dass man sie natürlich nur so weit ausüben kann, wie es die anderen nicht stört. Aber das ist ja bei einem Minarett eigentlich nicht. Also das Minarett ist ja nicht etwas, wo...
Ich glaube, kein grosser. Ich glaube, die Leute praktizieren einfach ihre Religion weiter und wir sind ein Land, wo Religionsfreiheit herrscht. Und ich finde, jeder soll das Recht haben, seine Religion auch zu praktizieren.
Für was es gemacht wurde? Ja, ich denke einfach, dass es etwas zu tun hat mit den Ausländern. Das ist einfach, ich denke wegen der SVP, weil die SVP hat etwas gegen Ausländer. Und ich muss sagen, ich bin selber Ausländerin und ich finde, das ist einfach ein Scheissdreck, weil sie wollen einfach damit sagen, Ausländer raus oder sozusagen.
Also ich bin, dass man die Initiative nicht gemacht hätte. Also.
So that was the state of affairs there in Switzerland. I want to turn to the audience and get your points of view now as well. We're talking about this ban on minarets as well. It's something that came up in the media, something that's quite close to home for a lot of us. So can I get some of your points of view? And what kind of, do you think they have a right to pass this sort of legislation here? We have a hand up here if you'd like to just...
I have just one observation that when Switzerland or France or countries like this, they want to move such an extent to the secular state that they don't want to listen anything of religiosism. Why is that? Always it comes of any kind of phobia, as always Islamophobia. There is like churches are showing up their figures, it's the cross out there. The Jews are wearing the dresses, particular Orthodox Jews, you can tell easily that he is a Jew. Why is always like Muslims it veils, Muslims it's minarets? Why is not any other thing? Why is keeping it as secular? Why is just Muslims, not any other religion?
Add something? Got another.
I just wanted to mention a point about what Amjad Saab said, that it is actually commendable that the US government has separated itself from religion and religious issues, which is not seen in Europe, in France and Switzerland, obviously, and obviously to their detriment. But the issue about the book, the Quran burning in the US by Pastor Jones, is obviously, we know the situation and he shouldn't have done that, but the reaction from the Muslims was so bad that they went and obviously killed quite a few non-Muslims in their own country and created uprising and
fueled the fire, didn't it?
Violence begets violence. That's the quote that everyone used. So I mean, the Muslims we can't talk about the blessed teachings of Islam if the other Muslims are kind of portraying it in this way.
Okay,
so
I want to get one or two more points of view. Fruitway, have you got something to add to that?
Very basic point. I think in the end, as Ahmadis, our job is far more important now than ever before. The Masih Islam has written a number of books on all these topics. For example, the book Al-Huda in Arabic, for example, is targeting the Arab world, for instance. I think it's about us educating ourselves first as Ahmadis and then talk to the people outside.
Yeah, there's a hand raised just behind you as well, yeah.
What I found a bit strange was that I was reading somewhere about the French law against the burqas, and one of the reasons or the pretext of it was to, in a way, protect the women's rights, because these women are perhaps, as they consider, being forced upon by their husbands to actually wear it. So, that was the reasoning. But if indeed that is the case, then they already have got the laws, which is to prevent any sort of injustice or, force enforcement upon the woman by the man. So
it's
why
one of
was
those bizarre laws. They're saying that you don't want the men to be able to force women what to wear, but surely President Sarkozy as a man is enforcing women on how they should dress. So
why do they need a special
it's a bit of a paradox in that respect.
Law just for this, where it can already be incorporated in their normal...
Yeah, I'm just turning back to you. I mean, we're talking about minarets, but also just places of worship as well. What kind of rights are there to protect the sanctity of these places of worship?
So places of worship are explicitly protected in the Quran. Right. The Quran is the only religious text that explicitly says that synagogues, churches, cloisters, and mosques are entitled to special protections by all people, period. That is a very fundamental teaching of Islam. And the practice of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ was to do just that. He invited a Christian delegation from Najran in his own mosque. He went out of his way to ensure that Christian churches would not be burned down or destroyed. He went out of his way to ensure that Jews were entitled to their settlements, that those synagogues would not be damaged. And yet fast forward to today and you see the deviance from those core teachings. So it is absolutely essential that places of worship be protected in Islam.
Yes, I'm just turning to you. That seemed to be the golden era of Islam, and Ahmadiyya, there's a renaissance of Islam as well. Turning to your experience within the Jamaat here in the UK, what has the Ahmadiyya Jamaat been doing to protect the sanctity of places of worship? Not just mosques, but how have we actually been reaching out to the wider aspects of society, whether they're Christians or Jews or coming from other faith backgrounds?
Well, it's right, going back to the time of the promised Messiah himself. He was very particular about respecting the beliefs and the mode of worship and the places of worship in his own time. And whenever he had guests of other faiths visiting Qadian, he would make sure that they had all the facilities they needed for the practice and the sanctity and the respect of their faith. So this has been the stand of the Ahmadiyya Jamaat throughout the world. And in spite of the fact that scores of our Jamaats have been disrespected and demolished and devastated, by others. Right. We have never reacted to any such action because these are evil actions, and we would never react to evil by evil. We have always shown the greatest tolerance and respect, even for those who have done these things. And we have taught them by a good example that this is not the way to respond to any differences or any disagreements related to faith or anything else. And therefore, the community has always taken a very strong stand in respecting the places of worship of other faiths. In fact, I know of a particular incident where the Jamaat was interested in purchasing a church which was in use. Right. And they were stopped from doing that because it was not a respect to the people of that faith that we should take over their place of worship and convert to a mosque. And actually, as you would remember, that even during the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, the Holy Prophet ﷺ actually stopped Muslims from demolishing any church or anything. Right. On the contrary, he would send Muslims to help the Christians to build their churches. Okay. So that is the level and degree of respect and sanctity that Islam has provided for other faiths and religions.
Okay, Jazakallah. I mean, just moving the conversation forward a bit more, unfortunately it seems that in today's society, in Muslim countries, these religious freedoms aren't always upheld. We actually have another video report. Our research team has really been working hard on this program. So let's take a listen to that special video report.
Good afternoon. I'm here today with the Secretary General of Amnesty International, Mr. Salil Shetty. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr. General Secretary. My pleasure. If I may ask you, with regards to religious freedoms in South Asia, what do you see as the underlying concerns from the point of view of Amnesty International?
Freedom of religion is a basic human right, and Amnesty stands firmly behind that idea. We have, all sorts of attempts in South Asia and in different parts of the world, Southeast Asia, Indonesia, where there have been attempts to curb these religious freedoms. Even in Europe, we are in a very odd situation where, on the issue of full-faced veils for Muslim women, we have been campaigning in Iran and Saudi Arabia that you cannot force women to wear veils. Now we have to campaign in France and Belgium saying that women who want to wear it should have the freedom to wear it. So we are in a reverse situation. But freedom of religion has to be applied consistently in all countries by all governments.
So there's a whole range of views there, and Ghalib, I just wanted to turn to you actually because you were there asking the question, especially to some of the members of Amnesty and other organisations. Just generally, just give us a roundup of what was the kind of sentiment that you got from the responses from these people. If we could just give the microphone to you, just give us a summary of do you think they're taking it seriously?
Well, having attended the conference, I think first and foremost it was a significant year in terms of human rights. You've got from abuses taking place in the Middle East, and you've got problems abounding, in Venezuela, and you've got in South Asia, more closer to home for the Ahmadi Jamaat, our Jamaat. You see that in Indonesia and Pakistan, that increasingly there's a problem of freedom of expression in these areas, where freedom of religion and freedom of expression are being seen as entirely controlled and regulated by the state.
So that was the video. Thanks for your analysis on that as well. We're going to be taking a break right now, but later on in the program, we're going to be carrying forward this point of view of trying to find out if religious freedoms are being upheld in Muslim countries and looking at them in particular detail. So stay with us after this short break. We'll be right back.
The Review of Religions is one of the longest-running religious magazines. In print since 1902, it continues to play an important role in presenting the noble teachings of Islam, reflecting its rational, harmonious and inspiring nature. It features articles and viewpoints on different religions, making religion and religious philosophy accessible to a wider readership. The Review of Religions was founded by Hazrat Mirza Ghulam Ahmad, peace be upon him, who claimed on the basis of divine revelation that he was the promised Messiah and Mahdi, whose advent had been foretold by the Holy Prophet of Islam, peace and blessings of Allah be upon him, and by the scriptures of other faiths. The annual subscription of this unique and enlightening magazine is just £15 per year or $30. To receive your copy of the Review of Religions, visit our website at www.reviewofreligions.org, where you can browse past issues and subscribe online, or contact us by email to info@reviewofreligions.org. The Review of Religions, a unique magazine of religious thought.
Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to this edition of Real Talk. We're having a look at religious freedoms, and in this second half we're going to be particularly looking at persecution. Amjad Saab, if I could just turn to you first. I want to know basically what are the issues when we talk about religious persecution. As we mentioned before, it's happening in Muslim countries, unfortunately, and particularly looking at them, what are the issues that people face in terms of persecution in some of these countries?
So the fundamental binding theme of all of these countries that would persecute Muslim minorities is that there is religiously based legislation targeting specific groups by name with the aim and effort of depriving them of their own identity and explicitly restricting their religious freedom. Right. And that can be in various forms. The most troubling form is in the blasphemy laws. And Pakistan has provisions, specific provisions, that explicitly target the activities of the Ahmadi community and to a larger extent other communities, right, restricting and criminalizing those activities.
Yes, I'm turning to you. I mean, some of our viewers must be watching this and thinking, this is crazy that they can pass legislation like this. What were the reasons behind this ordinance, and how did they actually get it through?
Well, actually, if you look at the history of persecution, it very actively started back in the 1930s, even before Pakistan was formed. Okay. And this was taken up by the Ahrar movement, who incidentally have come back, and they had a big meeting in Ludhiana in India just a few weeks ago. So it was this, and then of course this turned, the Ahrar movement turned into another movement in the 1930s, which was known as Khatm-e-Nubuwwat. And then there was the Jamaat-e-Islami of Maulana Maududi. And you see, these were three forces which were strongly anti-Ahmadiyya, and they brought this venom, of enmity and hatred against Ahmadis into Pakistan. And right from the beginning, from 1948, there were movements to declare Ahmadis as non-Muslims.
I just want to turn to you, Jazakallah Yasser, for the historical perspective. But I mean, looking at it from today's perspective, it's not just Ahmadis who are being persecuted; it's other religious communities as well. What kind of, how can the governments of countries like Pakistan, like these other Muslim countries, actually justify what they're doing when we've heard that Islam actually doesn't teach, us to behave in this way?
It's a excellent question. So first and foremost, the persecution of the Ahmadis is not the only persecution that exists in a country such as Pakistan or even Indonesia. The Christian community is very sorely persecuted in both countries. Most recently, and it was before a world audience, we saw that those who were a courageous voice against these blasphemy laws were assassinated. We saw the assassination of Salman Taseer, the governor of Punjab. We saw the assassination of Shahbaz Bhatti, the minority affairs minister who was Christian. Right. Those who voiced their concerns against this particular set of laws were assassinated. So that begs the question, how can a country that purports to be an Islamic state justify these very explicit and draconian provisions? Well, I think that in the case of Pakistan, they've justified it through legal means. And specifically, in 1988, in the case of Mujibur Rahman versus the state, the question of the Ahmadi issue was posed in a religious sense to the Federal Shariat Court. Yeah. And the Federal Shariat Court determined that the Ahmadi issue, the Ahmadi situation is such where their beliefs can be restricted because they are repugnant to Islam. Shortly thereafter, 5 years later, there were 8 appeals from Ahmadis who were challenging these laws brought before the highest court in Pakistan, the Supreme Court of Pakistan, a case known as Zahiruddin versus the state. And the court held 2 holdings. The court said that these particular laws do not violate the Constitution of Pakistan. Why? Because in the name of public safety and order, we as a state have the right to restrict religious practices that quote-unquote offend the majority. And secondarily, that, and this is remarkable, that Islam, and Pakistan in particular, has a right to has certain trademark rights over Islamic epithets, such as the call for prayer and Assalamu alaikum. And by using them in a quote-unquote deceptive way, the Ahmadis have violated company and trademark laws.
Really? Okay. It's really deciphering them with the way they're doing it. I want to get some points from the audience. Yes, we have some hands raised. Can we just pass the microphone to the back, please? Yeah, what would you like to add to the conversation?
In relation to other religious sects which has been prosecuted, you see similar patterns in Iran, for example, with the Baha'is, and as a respected panel pointed out, at the time when the Ahmadis were being persecuted, started in 1974 in relation to the act and the law, the ordinance XX. Similar pattern was seen in Iran when the Iranian Revolution took place, and the Baha'is were started to getting persecuted and chased. So, as respected Amjad Sahib pointed out, the persecution is done through legal means, and the problem is that human rights does allow a restriction of freedom of religion through legal means, and that is what the Islamic countries are using to persecute these religious minorities.
You know, unfortunately, we actually have certain religious groups fighting amongst themselves. It's not always from the government. And, you know, unfortunately, last year in May, we also had the tragic Lahore attacks. I understand there's someone in the audience who was actually there during the attacks. You know, I'd love to hear your perspective on what happened, and you know, if you could shed some light on that, please, for us.
In Lahore, like what happened in Lahore, what's going on in Pakistan, that was sort of a maximity of what was going on from over the decades in the society. It is not something that came out of blue and the way it happened and against the Ahmadiyya Jamaat. And the way even after that, there was just two entire different perspectives, how people behaved, even in Pakistan.
Can you give us a view of what actually happened on that day for the viewers who aren't aware of that?
Model Town Mosque, when it was happened, and there were a few guys, two guys who came inside the mosque. They started firing on the people, throwing hand grenades, and they were saying Allahu Akbar, Khatm Nabuwwat Zindabad, and they were definitely trying to kill. And those two guys were captured by Ahmadi, Khuddam and Ansar inside, who were in the mosque, and they were handed over to police later on.
I mean, it was a pretty tragic event. There was almost 100 people who were killed there, and you know, it's a large-scale attack.
There were lots of that. It's still something that you cannot forget, or it has a lot of impact on everybody who was in there. The total 86 people were martyred. It's a huge impact on all the families, all people around them, and many of the people, even in UK, they were connected to the families, and it's definitely something very hard to feel that and to go through that experience.
Yeah, I mean, Tony, you've had first-hand experience of what happened. What are your sentiments to the kind of people who portray events like this and actually push forward they take religious freedoms into their own hands? And you know, how does that affected you and how you view other religious groups?
That's what I was just explaining, that the way it happened, it is not something that came out of blue for one or two persons' individual act. It's been something, a result of long-term persecution. Like I've been spent 30 years of my life in there, so observing everything that's been happening, being in personal experience of the persecution everywhere, in the jobs, in universities, out in your public life. Like as the panel was mentioning, practically it is possible for anyone in Pakistan to go to the police and file a case against any person Ahmadi that I feel offended because he walks like Muslims. So this is still, and law permits this, any act that permits you. So this is all kind of hatred that was generated over there that resulted into something like this.
Yeah.
And this is definitely not good to have in societies against Ahmadis or any other, or any community in there.
Okay, Jazakallah, thanks for giving us your perspective as well. Amjad, I want to come back to you because from what I understand in terms of your legal practice as well, you've actually helped people to uphold their rights who have maybe seek refuge in other countries. Am I correct in understanding that? Can you shed some?
Yes, that's right.
What are your personal
well, as an
experiences?
attorney who, a lawyer in the U.S. who advocates for the rights of the dispossessed and those who are persecuted, I've had occasion to actually take on a number of cases of asylum for Ahmadis and for those who aren't Ahmadis. And that is very important. There is a system of law, and there's a system that's set up that can be used and utilized in defense of these individuals.
Right.
Now, getting out of those countries is very difficult.
Yeah.
Fleeing those countries is harrowing. And there are many Ahmadis who have done so, and many non-Muslims, non-Ahmadis, non-Muslims, and other religious minorities from these countries who have fled. I happen to represent, I'll give you two quick examples. I happen to represent an Ahmadi family from Indonesia a few years ago. It was a case of first impression for the United States government. And I was able to obtain asylum for this family of 6. And the United States was surprised by the level of religious violence in such a moderate country such as Indonesia, but more particularly and troubling, that the actual provisions were entrenched in the law to such an extent that the extremists who were committing these atrocities, in that case the Islamic Defenders Front, were taking sanctuary behind these laws. They were emboldened by these laws. So the United States very much was supportive of this asylum case. Similarly, I defended a family of Egyptian Coptic Christians. There is a blasphemy law in Egypt, Article 98F, which affects Ahmadis and Christians. The blasphemy law there has severely restricted this family's activities, and we were able to seek asylum for them. So there's a lot that can be done.
Okay, Yasab, I'd just like to get your points of view on one respect. What is the correct way that if there are religious communities that are facing persecution, how should they react to that persecution, and how should they, deal with that?
I think the most important thing is to hit the roots, get the roots out. For example, you have Khatm-e-Nabuwat. Khatm-e-Nabuwat is not restricted to Pakistan. It is international. You have Khatm-e-Nabuwat registered in UK. You have UK Khatm-e-Nabuwat. You have Khatm-e-Nabuwat registered in various countries in Europe. And they are the agents of hate-mongering.
So do you suggest that we rise up against Khatm-e-Nabuwat?
I think we must put pressure on our governments, say here in UK or USA or wherever we are, that such organizations, which are principally hate-mongering, and abusive to other faiths, religions, communities, they should be barred from entering and establishing themselves in these countries.
I want to get some wrap-up points from the audience as well. Let's look at religious persecution from a general perspective, not just of the Ahmadiyya Jamaat group. Yes, we have a point there.
I think one important factor is that although historically the blasphemy law and this persecution, it had its roots in religious extremism or religious conflicts, but I think more recently it's more of a case of a political means that especially if you look at South Asian countries, Pakistan, some other, where you've got a huge amount of frustrations in the public, and they're not, they don't have access to the economic power or to good means of a good quality of life. What the government actually sees is that by having these blasphemy laws and by having a minority which is targeted, and with these mullahs inflaming these feelings amongst the people, it sort of distracts them from the real issues, social issues, and so it's a more of a political tool used by the governments as well.
Okay, yeah, we had a hand raised here. Yep.
Yes, in relation to persecution in regards to all religious minorities, Muslim states in general, they have based their reason of persecution on Sharia law, and they reserve the reserved freedom of religion based on Sharia. So I think what we should do is put pressure on such human rights non-governmental organizations such as Amnesty, and make them challenge the Muslim states in relation to the Sharia, and not only talk about human rights in general, but talk about what is the Sharia really saying.
Right. That's a really valid point. We've got some more points of view. I'm trying to get as many of them included as possible. If you could just pass the microphone to the front here. Just briefly, what would you like to add in?
One quick point that people might not know what the Ahmadi stance is on the persecution. Obviously, it's very brutal. But there was a Times Online article a few years ago with His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmad, the head of the spiritual leader of the Ahmadi community. And the title was "Tolerance in the Face of Persecution." Right. And I mean, that is what we are doing as the Ahmadi community. We've been persecuted from all angles, but we're showing the world that we are a peaceful community, and we're just preaching tolerance back. Yeah. And hopefully that will overcome the hatred that is being thrown at us.
Yep, fantastic. Yeah, Qasim, just briefly, if you'd like to add something in.
Yes, I think the main problem about the persecution on the basis of a person's faith is that a person holds their faith as part of their own identity and is very close to them. And if they are being persecuted on the basis of that, then what's left of that person to then be able to integrate himself within society, or even claim asylum somewhere else and integrate over there? Because really a shot has been taken at their own personality, their own individuality. Yeah. And that's really hard for a person then to carry on with life.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, we're just a bit short on time, so I'm trying to wrap it up. Yasab, just turning to you, finally as a concluding remark. I mean, what would be your message to Muslim countries out there who unfortunately are persecuting people on the grounds of their religious belief?
I would say that in pursuance of the teachings of the Holy Quran, they should strengthen their faith in one God, Allah, and the teachings of the Holy Quran, and persuade themselves and their people to stick to the path which was set for the guidance of humanity by the Holy Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Okay, Jazakallah. And Amjad, what would be in terms of the whole discussion we've had today, and even in the other program that we did last time as well about human rights and how human rights relates to religious freedoms as well, what's the overriding principle that we should take away from this conversation?
Well, with respect to the Islamic world, I think the point is that Muslims need to understand their faith. They need to understand the essence of their faith. And in particular, the idea of a separation of mosque and state. That you cannot establish Sharia unless you meet the preconditions necessary for its sustenance. The word Sharia actually means life-giving water. There's deep meaning in that. The idea of constitutional protections is a prerequisite to imposing Sharia law on non-Muslims or on other minorities or other individuals deemed minorities. The idea of making sure that before you implement Sharia, that you understand and respect other religious bodies and religious institutions. This is precisely what is necessary in order to erect in a society. The Muslim world has lost that.
Okay, thank you very much, and Yasab, Jazakallah for your input as well. Thank you to the audience. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. I know some of you wanted to add in some extra points. But for the viewers watching at home, don't forget you can put in your points of view as well. You can email us on realtalk@mta.tv. Maybe there's a topic of discussion that you want us to include in future programs. Whatever it is, send us your comments and feedback, realtalk@mta.tv. Don't forget to visit our official website, mta.tv/realtalk. And also you can stay up to date with all of our updates on our Twitter pages. Details for you are there at the bottom of the screen. Finally, once again, I'd like to thank the guests here. And Amjad, thank you I know you travelled a long way just to be in this program. I want to thank all the guys who work behind the scenes as well to make this program happen. I hope you can join us next time. We're going to be continuing to discuss certain issues that affect us not only in this country but around the world, and particularly looking at it from a youth perspective as well. So stay tuned in to Real Talk as well, and inshallah I hope you can join me again next time for the next program. But until then, Assalamu alaikum.